Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, public safety. I am Jason Karp, Esquire, here with Teddy Joe Kennedy, otherwise known as TJ. TJ, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Jason. Great to be here with you today, and I'm glad you're thanking Uncle Ted there. That's nice.
Absolutely. So welcome to this week's edition of PSN Now, News of the Week. So turning to COVID news, TJ Kennedy.
So kind of a bad milestone here today. The National Fallen Firefighters Foundation announced earlier this week that 50 fire and EMS personnel have now died as a result of the pandemic. To me, this is it's a very bad milestone, not one we want to see continue to grow. I think it highlights something we've talked about over the last week or two on the important need for quality personal protective equipment for all first responders, and making sure that we are giving them the right tools so they are not contracting this pandemic as they treat and serve the citizens in their community.
Yeah, 100%. You know, and this actually our next story, you know, really is a follow-on to that, which is, as of today, in fact, all 50 states have started to ease restrictions on COVID. Today was the last day. Connecticut started ease some restrictions, and of course, this is being done on a state-by-state basis. So everyone's a little bit different, but it certainly, again, kind of begs the question of how we need to behave, and that COVID-19 does not discriminate. And although, you know, a lot of folks think that it affects more so elderly and weakened immune systems, which, you know, there's some evidence to suggest it doesn't discriminate against anyone, including first responders who are out there on the field facing this every day. So really critical that both public safety and our citizenry at large, you know, have to continue to really act responsibly, because this is a real consequences. People are dying.
They are, and I think we have to remember that, you know, wearing a mask is not necessarily just to protect you, it's really to protect the people around you. Many people are asymptomatic. They don't know they have the disease, and they can spread that virus unintentionally. And I think when we look at some of the early numbers, I'm not a epidemiologist, but just from reading the articles I've read, it seems like the amount of exposure in closed places like homes or smaller locations definitely raise the likelihood that you will catch an infection from somebody else. So as firefighters or paramedics or EMTs come in contact with patients and they're exposed to this over and over again, and especially in smaller spaces, you know, it's going to affect them worse. And they're going to have, you know, more contraction of the disease. And so I think that we need to be very smart about this and be smart about our activities, even with the loosening of restrictions.
Yeah, spot on. And great use of the word epidemiologist, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
I don't get to use that every week, but recently it's come around a little more.
It's new, you know, it comes in, you know, I try to throw it in whenever I can. So you know, kudos to you on that. Speaking of which, a follow on to our last week's story about drones. Remember, we spoke a little bit about use of drones to monitor stay-at-home orders. And we just talked about it kind of in a theoretical sense, as it had come up as a concern. Well, now we have an actual situation where French authorities had been using drones to effectively enforce stay-at-home orders, and a French court has invalidated for violation of civil rights and privacy those practices. So the French police now no longer can use video recording capability on their drones, and until there are appropriate safeguards in place to either mask the identity of the individuals, or there's some other restrictive rules in place regarding use of that data, it is strictly forbidden. So one court has spoken on this issue.
You know, I am a huge fan of unmanned aerial systems, UASs, drones, however we want to refer to them, for public safety use. I think they are tremendous. We've seen lots of safety benefits coming out of search and rescue teams leveraging them. We've seen benefits coming out of law enforcement and fire agencies, you know, leveraging them for early situational awareness. But at the same point, I'm a huge fan of the appropriate safeguards and policies and procedures being in place to ensure we maintain our privacy. And I think that there has to be an appropriate balance of these two. I think one of the things we're seeing in this pandemic is we need to take extraordinary measures and leverage technology, whether it's around contact tracing or whether it's around exposures. But also, I think we need to make sure that the privacy that citizens deserve is also protected. And I think that there's a very important balance. And I do believe that for both agencies, as they're thinking about this, it's about putting in place the right policies and procedures. And certainly for our courts and our regulatory agencies, I think it's about balance.
So let me pull that thread a little bit there, Teddy Joseph. So I think, some may have heard, and a pretty important story, that you remember the shooting at the Naval Training Center down in Pensacola last year by a Saudi-born trainee. Well, it turns out that individual, they found out, does have, in fact, ties to Al-Qaeda, and in fact was coordinating that attack with Al-Qaeda, which is, very, very unfortunate and a sad thing to have to report. That we're continue to face this kind of terrorism on our soil. And so there's really two stories here, though. Obviously, there's that story, which I think is critically important for us to remain, cognizant of, that we're still at risk. But the way they found out about the connection was by hacking into the Apple's operating system, the cell phone that he used. But Apple had been criticized again by FBI because Apple would not allow or assist in opening up the phone. FBI apparently was able to do that independently. So kind of pulling on that privacy, security, civil liberties thread that we were just talking about with drones, is this different?
I think it's a different set of elements that drives us, but I do believe it's the similar privacy versus law enforcement. But I will say, when you get into investigating terrorism and you get into folks who have been either convicted of committing a crime or who were killed in a terrorist attack or other things, and looking into their devices, I think that's a little different than random searches by drone in somebody's backyard of wearing a mask or not wearing a mask, where they have an expectation of privacy. I think that is something that I think the rule of law is here for a very important reason. I think the societies we have today are because of the rule of law. And I think that what we've done with our constitutions, not just in the US, but abroad and others that we're talking about, what we've done to ensure that there is this law and order, but also a balance of personal privacy and personal rights. I think it's an important debate. I think that it also goes to show very talented technical resources being involved in law enforcement measures are also in place today. And at the same point, individuals who are using their phones for day-to-day work or day-to-day lives should have an expectation of privacy of their personal information.
Yeah, this is a tough one. I mean, I think in this particular case, I tend to side with you. I mean, in this case, there's certainly no question about the crime that was committed. Caught in the act, was, the individual was actually shot dead as part of the incident. Clearly, he had committed the crime. Where we get into the real issues are that whole innocent until proven guilty little quirk in our criminal justice system.
I won't call it a quirk, I'll call it a feature.
Yeah, a feature, absolutely. But, then it really, you have to kind of weigh those two, criteria about the importance of getting access to the evidence and the information, but at the same time protecting liberties, if it's not clear whether the individual actually committed a crime or not, and where do you draw that line? So more to come on this. I don't think this is the last we heard of this debate, but interesting issues going on right now with privacy and crime, criminal investigation, the last couple of weeks. So speaking of technology and drones, did you hear about the drone out of Fairfield, Connecticut, I believe it was, for search and rescue? Rescued a gentleman who was apparently unable to divert his kayak back to shore and had to abandon it and was pinned up against some rocks at a lighthouse. He was able to call 911 and they showed up, but it was dusk and they couldn't see him from shore. So off went the drone. They were able to find him, send out the rescue boat, and within 30 minutes he was warm and safe on shore.
Spectacular use of drones for public safety and search and rescue. I can't imagine many search and rescue teams in the world who don't want or don't have drones already in place today. Some of the more advanced ones I've seen are using many, many drones. I actually met with one agency that had 60 drones for their search and rescue team, and almost every other person had one in a backpack, and they would use it, and they had 20 minutes battery power, and they could trade off with someone else if they needed to. And this just makes sense. And as somebody who has spent a fair amount of time doing helicopter rescues, helicopters are amazing tools, and they're great for transporting patients. But at the same point, there's much of what can be done with a vertical takeoff and landing platform like a drone versus a helicopter that could be more cost effective and certainly safer in some unique weather situations or others. So I think there's an absolute demand for very well done drone usage for search and rescue.
Yeah, absolutely. Amen. And there's, as we've talked about, firehouses of the future being drone only, and of course we know that, they're being used today in order to create situational awareness and police calls before, officers arrive. I mean, there's just tremendous uses for this technology. And although, as we talked about, we've got to balance the privacy concerns, there's just clear-cut cases where it makes absolute sense in the world.
On that note, for those who haven't watched other episodes talking about a drone-only fire station, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't explain what that was on this session. This is not to replace existing fire stations, which obviously are critical and could also have drone platforms on them. But one of the things we've heard from a fire chief was that in their very far reaches of their fire district, it could make sense for them in the future to have a drone-only fire station near the edges of their fire district that could give airborne situational awareness of a wildland fire or of a car accident and provide that to the incoming units that might be 20 minutes away in a response time. A unique example of something that sounds like it's far off in the future, but could happen this year.
Yeah, absolutely. So in other tech news, speaking of our good friends in public safety, the chairman of the FCC, Ajit Pai, who is responsible for establishing the rules for auctioning off the T-band spectrum. And for those of you may be aware, the T-band spectrum has been used, at least in part, by public safety for many, many years for certain land mobile radio in 11 largest markets in the United States. And we know there was legislation requiring that spectrum be auctioned off for commercial use, and those public safety users be moved off of that spectrum. Now, that's been a controversial topic for as long as that act has been passed, which happened to coincide with the act authorizing FirstNet. And now Chairman Pai has, while he is preparing for the auction, which is supposed to take place next February, he has urged Congress to repeal the law and thinks it's a very bad idea to try to move public safety off the T-band. So TJ, what's the controversy here? Why is this important?
I mean, this is important because many of our largest cities in America, the top 11 or so, have existing legacy land mobile radio systems that operate in this spectrum. The T-band is very low band spectrum. It's very good at going through walls and operating in metropolitan environments. And many of them have invested hundreds of millions, if not even over $1 billion in radio systems that are on the spectrum. The particular line in the act that did this, I think, has bipartisan support in Congress right now to have this particular line repealed. I support that as well. For one main reason is that if you understood the details in the act, and it's something I know a fair bit about, having looked at it and read it many times, is it would have required that an auction would fund the costs of moving all of those agencies off to other spectrum, which in today's day and age would mean entirely new systems. And I think in 2020, the focus should be more on maintaining those legacy systems and leveraging broadband and other technologies to drive next generation solutions for public safety, and not necessarily doing full replacements in very large cities in America that have typically very good systems working today that have proven that they work well.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, and let's face it. I mean, back in 2012, there was still uncertainty about the need for commercial spectrum. We know since then that all of the major carriers have picked up a significant amount of spectrum, and of course, you've got the potential specter of Dish Network, entering into this market as well with spectrum that they purchased at auction. So, I don't know that there's even the need from the commercial side necessarily that, this spectrum have to be utilized for purposes other than public safety, at least for the time being. And the costs of moving these folks and the time frame for moving these folks actually devalues that spectrum, right? I mean, so, you know, if I'm going to bid on this as a commercial operator and I don't know when I'll get access to it, could be 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road, I'm not going to want to put up as much money, and that spectrum's not going to have as much value to me, especially if I don't necessarily need it. So, you know, it just seems there's a lot of also commercial reasons and practical reasons why it just doesn't make sense to move forward as they had originally contemplated back in 2012.
No, you're right. And if we look at it, this auction wouldn't happen at least till 2021. So there's time now for Congress to pass this. I think the sooner the better to modify this one provision. I do think that moving them in 2 years from this very, very large city between 2021 and 2023 is not practical. And I think it's a huge cost that should be looked at in a very different way. And the business cases should really be put in place for what would happen with those kinds of, you know, huge forklift upgrades in the future. And I think we're much better off leaving them with, you know, and maintaining the existing good legacy systems that they have.
Yeah, 100%. I guess the only issue, and I will leave this as an open issue opposed to one we'll resolve here, is I know prior to the thought about T-band transition, the FCC, of course, had issued its narrow banding requirement for LMR. And we know that for some of the larger markets, that in itself could be very expensive. So if they do remain on T-band and the law requiring transition is repealed, the question now becomes, is there still this narrow banding requirement, and are they going to have to invest, you know, potentially millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in achieving that goal? And I'll kind of leave it at that. I don't think we need to answer that question, but one that folks need to be thinking about, you know, no matter how this turns out at the end, and certainly the FCC, you know, as they progress through with their regulatory pronouncements. So now we get to the segment at PSN Now News of the Week called PSN Wow. Okay, the special effects are getting better every week.
Very expensive special effects.
That was pretty awesome. So PSN Wow, these are news stories of specific import, sensationalism, heroism, idiocy, stupidity, or just plain fun. Well, this week, we definitely we're going to call this our hero segment. And this is a sensational story and an important story on so many different levels. We want to talk a little bit about the large fireball explosion at the warehouse, the vaping warehouse in LA last week, injured 12 firefighters. All I can say is, first, a heart goes out to every one of the firefighters who responded to that, the injured and the non-injured. The impacts are beyond even my comprehension of having to live through that. And true, absolute 100% heroes. When we talk about first responders, when we talk about public safety, this is really what we think about. And while this may not happen every day, these are the folks that run to these events and manage these events when they do happen. And that's what makes them all so special in our hearts and in the hearts of America. But a sad and inspirational story all at the same time. It was a vaping shop or a vaping warehouse that had butane and other chemicals in there. And what appeared to be a normal building fire became a huge mayday in a matter of seconds, with a tremendous fireball explosion that melted helmets and burned firefighters and charred the fire truck, and just the aftermath. And there are videos on YouTube and other places that folks can see. It's truly, truly amazing. Of course, my good friend TJ is a former firefighter himself, has personal experience. TJ, tell us a little bit about what these folks are facing in these kinds of circumstances. You know, why it's so important, you know, in terms of safety and physical health as well as mental health, and just, you know, what are they experiencing and what did they experience in going through this?
So, I mean, I think there's a number of points to consider. One is that firefighting is a very dangerous activity, and we've been spoiled a bit in the United States and in many other countries that the good implementations of fire code, the implementations of sprinklers, especially in commercial buildings, have greatly reduced the number of very large, dangerous fires that firefighters respond to every day. And that's kind of a good news, bad news story. The good news is there's way fewer of them today, which puts our firefighters in this kind of grave danger less than they used to be. At the same point, we're not necessarily in them as often, or even potentially training on the dangers that are there. And the dangers have gotten much bigger. There's so much more plastic. There's so much more fuel utilized in building materials today. In this warehouse example, when we think of butane and other things that go into a smoke shop from a ingredients perspective, that's a part of that. I mean, very, very dangerous, hazardous materials, and the hazardous materials that firefighters encounter today are much more prolific than they were 20 or 30 years ago. And I think that the talent of these LA firefighters was amazing. They were doing their job like they had every other day, going to these massive commercial fires that I think most people couldn't even imagine responding into, with personal protective equipment that is very, very good. But we have to remember, it still has to be good enough to allow a firefighter to move quickly and walk through a building and drag hose and bring equipment and wear a mask and wear breathing apparatus. And at the same point, it's not impenetrable to an explosion or to massive fireballs. And that's what this was. I mean, massive amounts of heat. I mean, helmets melted, turnout gear was burning or coming off of them. I mean, Nomex, which is part of this, actually designed that when it is going to be burning in that situation, kind of falls off. The videos from the local media after the incident of just the firefighter personal protective equipment, the burned ladder trucks and fire engines that were just outside in front of this building on the street. I mean, literally charred down into the interiors of these $1 million ladder trucks is devastating. And I think it's an eye opener for every firefighter in the world to look at and say, this is what we do every day. These are the kinds of buildings we go into, these fires every day, and this could happen to me this afternoon. This could happen to me tonight. This could happen to me tomorrow. And so when we see firefighters working out to be in the best shape that they can be and to go fight fires like this, the impact, even if they of a much smaller incident on the physicality of that firefighter and getting them in and out of there safely is tremendous. The impact when 12 of them are injured and have traumatic injuries and are burned and literally burned through their firefighter turnout gear is extremely sad. First of all, I mean, my hearts go out to the entire LA fire community for the recovery and quick recovery of all these firefighters. They've been blessed that a number have now been discharged, and a number are probably getting outpatient treatment for burns and other things post that initial incident. But there are a number of them that are critically injured and were on ventilators and since are improving, and they're all expected to live. But this is probably due to amazing personal protective equipment, the amazing health of these firefighters, and the great medical care they're receiving. It does not downplay that all of them could have been killed. All of them could have been killed with this kind of an explosion. And for all of us in public safety technology and communications too, listening to the radio call and the Mayday and what was going on, and the incident commander and the fear in the voice of what was happening was tremendous. I had a hard time listening to it. It shows you what amazing work all firefighters around the world are doing each and every day, and we should never forget it. I think we think often of the amount of EMS calls and the interaction we see on day-to-day 911 calls with firefighters, but I think we don't remember the tremendous danger every minute that they go into in fires like this, and we have to remember that. We see it more on the big wildland fires. I think when we think of the everyday alarms they go to that could just be an alarm, but then one day that alarm is this massive fireball that ends up being an explosion that can kill you and all of your fellow firefighters. It's just devastating.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well said. And I know we're running short on time, but just quickly, what about the psychological element here? I mean, not just for the firefighters who were directly impacted, but everybody who responded and seeing their fellow firefighters being injured, having to use fire extinguishers to put out flames, on your colleagues. This is a big issue, firefighter mental health and wellness. We know we've talked to a number of different folks about this. What's the impact there?
There's short term, there's midterm, and there's long term impacts. And I think we often think of the short term. I would say, myself and many other firefighters, paramedics, and other first responders I've worked with do well to compartmentalize the day-to-day, the interactions with folks that they're trying to save in their biggest time of need. I think it's totally different when it's your fellow firefighter, it's your fellow paramedic, it's the person who was standing next to you going into that building. And I think you saw that in the response to douse those firefighters and get them into an ambulance and get them transported to a local hospital. You saw the police escorts. I mean, it affects me emotionally just to think about it, because I've watched the video, and when you're trying to save your own, and you're trying to dispatch your LA Fire helicopters to be close by to fly your own potentially to a medical center. Those are the calls you never want to get, and at the same point, you want to be the first one there to help your fellow firefighter. And so, all of us would volunteer for making that happen, but it's going to stick with them for the rest of their lives. It's dramatic. They should understand this will have a mental and physical and emotional impact on them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a truly human story, and a true story of heroism by our first responders. And now police are involved. I mean, this is unfortunately, there's a criminal investigation about the start of the fire, the location, Smoke Tokes. Apparently, there was another building of the same name back in 2016 that had a major fire in the same area. They don't know if they're connected yet, but I know that arson investigators are looking at it. And it'd be very sad if this was an intentionally caused event. But in either event, our hearts and our prayers go out to everybody affected by this incident, true heroes. And on that, I want to thank everybody for tuning in to this week's episode of PSN News of the Week. And until next time, I'm Jason Carp Esquire with Teddy Josephs Kennedy, otherwise known as TJ, and we will see you soon. Take care.